I genuinely do believe that if you ever wanted to live a profoundly meaningful life, then today is actually a gift. Because of the actions today, people born 50 years from now will be impacted as a result. And we do generally have more at our fingertips than any other previous generation to make a difference. So in that sense, when we go apathy to agency, we actually look at the opportunity to live a profoundly meaningful life, then despite all of the negative headlines, it really is a gift and an opportunity to be alive right now. We may not have much, but what are we doing? And are we going to run away? Or at the very least, are we going to give it a go?
I'm Kian Alavi, and this is Built for Good. This show is for community builders, the ones leading missions that matter. We're here to help you move with more clarity and less guesswork. Real stories, hard-won lessons, data that challenges assumptions, and insights that accelerate decision-making. One of my favorite sayings is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Meaningful work does not have to mean going alone. Now let's build some good together.
Today's guest is Michael Sheldrick, co-founder of Global Citizen. Global Citizen is a global advocacy organization focused on ending extreme poverty. Through large-scale campaigns, partnerships, and policy engagement, Michael and his team have helped mobilize millions of people and secure billions of dollars in commitments from governments and corporations. But beyond the scale, Michael's work focuses on a deeper challenge: how to turn attention into action in a world where many people feel disconnected or disengaged. In today's conversation, we'll talk about the crisis of apathy, what actually motivates people to take action, and what it takes to turn big ideas into real-world impact. Michael, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Great to be on the show.
Thank you for being here. I love your background, and as I shared with you earlier, I could probably put this up in my background. It's an amazing book. I hope to get into it. Michael, maybe you could just start by bringing us up to, in a thumbnail, if you will, just bringing us up to who you are in this moment, your journey that brought you to being a co-founder at Global Citizen, and where that fire came from to do this work.
So I'm here speaking to you from Brooklyn, New York, but as you can tell, this is not a Brooklyn accent. I grew up in Australia, Perth, Western Australia, the most isolated city in the world. And look, I was that kid who was really bad at sports, right? Which I know is blasphemy for an Australian to admit that, but I could not kick a footy ball to save my life, right? I was also that kid who was bad academically. At the start of high school, I still remember a teacher telling my mom, Michael is ranked bottom of the classroom. At this rate, he's not even going to finish school, let alone get into university. But there was something about that teacher who, for whatever reason, he saw something in me which I hadn't seen in myself. One day at school, he just said to me, he said, you know what? You may not believe in yourself. I believe in you. I think there's more to you than meets the eye. And if you're willing to meet with me in recesses, after school, like put in the extra work, I think you could be the top kid in the class by the end of the year. And I remember just thinking at the time, wow, you're right. I don't believe in myself, but if this guy's willing to take a chance on me, then what the heck, let's give it a go. And 6 months after that, I kid you not, last day of school, there he was giving me this certificate with a very Aussie way of doing so, outstretching his hand saying, well done, mate, you did it. And I was number one in the class. And after that, I was like, wow, okay, this works. You get an opportunity, you put your heart and soul into it, and wow, okay, it can pay off. So years later, finished school, top 1% of the state, got into law school. And in Australia, we have this saying that says, never get tickets on yourself, meaning don't forget where you've come from. And yes, I had worked hard, but I never thought I was exceptionally intelligent or gifted in any way. I just thought, look, I had this great teacher, had the opportunity to go to reasonably good school in Perth, Western Australia, which despite being isolated is a beautiful place. Kind of like, I'm told it's similar to Southern California when I'm trying to describe it to Americans. And I thought, you know, how can I make sure kids around the world, the millions of kids who, for whatever reason, don't have access to great schools, teachers, how can I make sure that they have the same opportunity that I did and I was grateful for? And so very first thing I did, went around my old shopping mall, got all this stuff donated, did a quiz night at my old high school, raised $1,000 to build a school in Papua New Guinea.
Whoa.
And it was great. In my summers and winters, I got to go over to India, Bangladesh, and I'd say, wow, it's great we're having an impact. We're building these schools. But you would just be confronted by the need. You know, so many teachers that needed to be hired, so many school meals that needed to be funded. And that's where, coming back to Australia, while still at university, I met the other co-founders of what would become Global Citizen. And we were grappling with this question of scale. How do we build a movement of citizens to help end extreme poverty? And cutting a long story short, we came up with this model of doing music events, concerts, and the only way you could get tickets was through downloading our app, volunteering your time, taking action. We would give you points, and you could trade in those points for a chance to go in the draw to one of our events. In 2011, we managed to convince John Legend to come to our event in Australia. And 9 months after that, my last year in university, we found ourselves standing on the great lawn of Central Park for what would become the first Global Citizen Festival, headlined by the likes of Neil Young and the Foo Fighters. And so a decade and a half later, we've helped mobilize more than 40 million citizen actions around the world, which in some shape, way, or form has helped lead to more than 1 billion life-saving interventions. And so in a nutshell, that's the story of my involvement, Global Citizen. And that story of a teacher, the gratitude for great education is, I guess, my why, what motivates me even today.
That's an incredible story. You start humbly, and then you start talking about traveling to other countries and supporting the work and finding the work, and also likely coming up front and personal, maybe even kind of rock to your world, rock to your personal psychology with extreme poverty, right? And I think one of the things about Global Citizen is it has an ambitious goal. And ambitious goals is a really important part of your book. People, go get this book. Can we talk about the ambitious goals, this idea in the book around a very important idea where we're looking for progress, not purity or perfection, some would say. And then there's a strong framework, of a kind of a simple framework that's really strong when it comes to getting in action here. My guesstimate here, and we didn't talk about it in your intro, you didn't share it, but my guesstimate is that you iterated your way to this understanding, you and your co-founders, in terms of like, how do we put together something that actually works, that gets people motivated and in motion? If we need to, one of the things that I love about this book is get in motion, right? The outcomes, we may not be able to control the outcomes, but let's get in motion. So if you could start a little bit about ambitious goals, why that matters. If you could talk a little bit about the framework, and I'm going to add a few more questions about being a policy entrepreneur, which I think is a term that lots of people haven't heard before.
You know, I think your point around motion is a really key point. And today, I mean, I get people reaching out to me on LinkedIn, on Instagram. And if any of your listeners want to reach out, and if I can help in some way, then please feel free to do so, because I'm always keen to pay it forward. And the reason why I do that is because when we were starting out, we didn't necessarily have access to all of these famous people. We didn't have access to all the big foundations. All we had was the power of our ideas. And it was thanks to a few small group of initial supporters that was willing to back those ideas why we were so successful, right? And so one of my friends, Ari Robinson, who wrote a great book himself called The Opportunity Gap, he often talks about the power of bold, audacious goals. And what he means by that is he says that sometimes an idea, if it's clear enough, no matter how naive it may seem, will stand out like a lightning rod and attract support, even if you lack experience, expertise, or initial funds. If the goal is clear, if the pathway to impact is tangible, others will perceive your imagination, believe in it, and join in its impact. And I think right now, especially right now, in a world of all these crises, people are craving that kind of clarity. People are yearning for solutions, and they're craving proof that our actions can still have an impact. So when you offer people that, people will move. they're willing to step up and they're willing to contribute. So I often say, before you take an action, the only thing you need is the clarity of the solution itself that you believe in. You don't need to know how exactly you will implement it. You don't need to know the journey, just having clarity around the solution. And then if you ask people, you will find, yes, 9 times out of 10, people will still say no or not get back to you, but you will find that initial group of supporters. And I think with Global Citizen, I still think back to one of our first campaigns, and I talk about this in the book, was the eradication of polio. And I had no idea how to do a concert. I had no idea about how to organize an event. But I think through the people I emailed, the nonprofits, and how quickly that got forwarded on. Then I got this phone call from this producer. She had just met this American guy in Hawaii, so Australian guy in Hawaii, as you do, surfing, moved to Australia, didn't know anyone, but funnily enough, produced benefit concerts. And I had a phone call and she goes, look, I know you don't have enough to pay me a salary. You're like this startup, but do you really think you can raise $50 million to eradicate polio? And I said, yeah, I do. And she got behind us. And 6 months later, we had John Legend coming out to Australia. And that was our first event and first campaign and the proof point. And so, yes, we need movement, and movement with clarity can be very powerful. And on the subject of movement, I do genuinely believe when you come up with goals, if you can break it down, you don't need to know the whole journey, but if you can just break it down into the next actionable step. My grandma has this great quote, and she grew up in the Blitz, so it does sound a bit morbid, but promise you it's true. She goes, Michael, why are you worrying? You die if you worry, you die if you don't. So why worry at all, right? And what she means is sometimes right now we have all this information that we can sometimes be infected by this paralysis, I guess, and analysis paralysis, and just focus on something that you can do today, an action in pursuit of that goal. Maybe it's an email, maybe it's a LinkedIn message, and you'll see stories in the book, not even from my experience at Global Citizen, from others. Someone will talk about reaching out on LinkedIn. That's how it often happens. And to that end, and I'll finish here, but there's a great quote which I use in the book, and I have it on my fridge magnet. When I first moved to New York, I'm a bit of a history buff, so I went up to Hyde Park, the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it was actually a quote in the gift store, and I have this magnet on my fridge today, and it's from Eleanor Roosevelt, and she once said, allegedly, the way to begin is to begin. And I think sometimes, we must simply just begin, right? And not miss our moment. And so if we can break it down and act on it, and I often think that if we do that, others are inspired by it. The research all shows the best way to motivate a bias for action in others is by sharing with them the impact of your own actions, however small.
I love it. I love it. Just where you started there, a big, audacious goal, 50 million to eradicate polio. I mean, clear as day. I also like that naive is the word you use, and maybe being young and getting started, it was naive. And the best things that I've ever done in my life started with naive goals, which I at the time didn't think were naive. But I like the idea of really just big, clear, simple, naive goals that get you excited. And even setting that goal, that's movement.
Yeah.
Right? That's movement. Just by setting the goal and saying it out loud and moving towards it. In the early part of your book, you do talk about your first concert that you throw. And it's a pretty wild story to see it come together. And I loved how you were like, I had the ear of the prime minister, but I had to prove that there was citizen support for this. And, you threaded this needle, you pulled it together, and then you got the check. And so goes everything. But you said this in your intro, there was that person that believed in you and said something, right? And you believed in something and you said something, and actions begin to manifest. And so I think it's really important, especially in this time. You said worried and disenchanted. We're going to talk about apathy. Yes, you can worry. Grandma's right, but it's not going to do anything. Maybe get going and start thinking about what you can do. So let's move on to the idea of a policy entrepreneur. Now, just kind of upfront, especially here in the States, I feel that a lot of us are disenchanted with government and policy.
Yeah.
We don't think it works. Clearly, if they did, a lot of things would be occurring, like a release of files that were promised and maybe the spending of taxpayer dollars in ways that most of the middle of the tent, you may lean one way, you may lean the other, but the quiet majority is a little bit disenchanted with this idea of policy. Maybe we think that special interests own and capture the government, and that's just how things are going. So to be a policy entrepreneur in this moment may feel daunting or not even worthwhile. Can you maybe speak to that?
I mentioned before I love history, right? And in the book, I quote, I think fairly early on, Benjamin Franklin, who is one of my favorite founding fathers. And through the book, I ended up doing a speech at the sole remaining residence that Franklin lived in. And it's not in Philadelphia, it's not in Boston, it's not in Paris, it's in London, believe it or not, where he lived for, I think, 16 years. And after giving this speech in Book Talk, they asked me to join the board. And as I've got to learn more about this incredible founding father who was a larger-than-life character, if America had never become independent, he would probably be still famous today. We would talk about him. But one of his famous comments is when leaving the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by someone, Mr. Franklin, what sort of government have we arrived at, right? Are we going to become another monarchy? Like, we're going to have a king of America? Like, what are we going to do? And he famously said, we have a republic if you can keep it, right? And I think especially now, that statement, as we approach America's 250th birthday, that statement is really resonant and timely, right? And I think it comes down to us as citizens, as individuals, right? How are we going to get involved and recognizing that policy impacts all of us, right? It's what we make available to our kids in school by way of food, what's made available in terms of what they're taught, access to healthcare. I mean, we know these things. Even recently in New York, when we were impacted by 2 snowstorms over the recent winter, making sure that the roads are cleaned in a timely manner so it doesn't cause all this disruption and people can get on with their lives. I mean, policy impacts us almost every day. We may not realize it, and we all have a choice to get involved. And what I make the case for in the book is don't think about impact and policy just in terms of your vote as a citizen, because there's so much you can do. And I use a lot of stories who I call policy entrepreneurs. And by the way, where policy entrepreneur came from, I should just say this because it can seem a little bit like aloof and people say, well, where did that come from?
Or too academic or whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So when I was founding Global Citizen last year for high school, I didn't know if I would get funding to keep Global Citizen going. And me and my co-founders, we had applied for funding. And I was therefore applying for scholarships because I didn't want to practice law. And as part of the entrance exam, I had to write, well, what did I want to look at? What did I want to study? And one of my professors at the time in Perth, I was explaining to him how we had used this concert and the campaign around it to help raise $50 million to eradicate polio. And he said, oh, you're basically a policy entrepreneur, not someone in government, but someone who has used innovative means like music, culture, citizen action in order to make a difference and affect decisions, right? And so one of my points in the book is it's actually applied to people who often aren't in government, who don't hold public office. They might be ordinary citizens, they might be small business owners, they might be local musicians, cultural icon, but in their way, they are making an impact. And so it was my attempt from the incredible leaders, advocates I've met around the world to distill it into this 8-point practical guide that anyone can use, whether you have a local Rotary Club, whether you are in a local school, or whether you're someone like Taylor Swift, in order to make a difference and just to break that down and make it accessible. And to give you one example, yesterday I was at this community college here in New York City and I was given this talk. And at the end of it, one of the questions came from this incredible young woman. She was, I think, 15 or 16 years old. And she came because she had launched this campaign in New Jersey about the impact of some of the local pollution that was going on. And she had identified who had the ability to make a difference. And she had a very clear solution. And to our discussion earlier, she basically got up, got the microphone, this 15-year-old woman, and she said, "This is the person who can make a difference in my local community. This is the change I need." And it wasn't a big change. It's just a little bit of regulation when it comes to pollution. And on this panel I was on, you had a CNN anchor, you had people involved in philanthropy, and they were inspired by her because she had identified who could make the impact, the change she wanted to see. And by her even raising it here, she was building a network, a network of partners who could apply pressure and get the change in her local community. And we all said, let's follow up, let's do this, because we were all inspired by the clarity she brought to the conversation. And so that's really what I'm trying to do in the book, is to break it down, make it accessible, and show that there are things that each of us can do right now, no matter the issue that you care about, in order to make the world better, more prosperous, safer, and ultimately a world in which, whether it's extreme poverty, whether it's environmental challenges, but a world in which we're all part of the solution.
I love it. A few things about policy. Policy happens to you whether you like it or not. And sometimes the things that are happening to you are a lack of policy. And for those who don't want to engage with it, you are, whether you are consciously or subconsciously. I mean, you may be walking down the street and you may be cursing a situation that's going on your block, and that's either good or bad policy. So maybe there needs to be a larger discussion about what is policy and how it touches everyone's lives so that they can feel more connected to themselves and their ability to use their voice. I mean, I feel like, yes, what you said earlier, go vote. It's an important thing to do. But also you have agency, and you can begin to do things that should affect how your world progresses, right? And if you don't do things, why, right? So getting out of the I'm not going to do things, getting towards the I want to do things, but giving folks a vocabulary, a framework, an understanding of like, yes, policy is yours if you want it to be. I don't know if in your understanding of the states anyways, where you and I both are, do you have a sense of what level the population understands their ability to influence policy? Or is it really just apathy everywhere? And it's the government and the rest of us. Sorry, the government captured by the elites and then the rest of us.
So I will say this, when we were co-founding Global Citizen, it was 15, 16 years ago, we were these optimistic young people. But it did feel at the time, this is sort of the post-2008 Obama election, right? And you remember some of the words from that campaign, whether you agree with his politics or not, or the policies he ultimately enacted, the framing spoke to a lot of people that he initially used, right? We are the ones we've been waiting for. Yes, we can.
Right.
And I think there was a whole group of us as young people who said, yeah, we're going to start an organization. We're just going to do it. And it wasn't just on extreme poverty, it was on issues like climate change. There was a whole number of issues out there. You might remember in 2012, there was the Coney 2012 campaign, and it backfired spectacularly. But to your point, there was this naive audacity of these young kids from America saying, hey, we're going to do this campaign and we're going to go out and end the use of child soldiers and go after this murderous guy, Joseph Kony, right? And there was that sense, well, we can do something about it. There's no denying that when you look at studies today, that there is this huge sea of apathy where I think most age groups, particularly under the age of 55, question not just whether our actions can make a difference, but if there's any point in even trying, right? And combined with that is this sea of loneliness and despair. They've declared a loneliness epidemic, not just here in the States, but in many countries around the world. And I read this alarming statistic a few weeks ago, which said something like 1 in 5 young people globally don't feel they have someone to turn to if they find a challenge or get hit by a massive hurdle, right? 1 in 5 basically say there's no one in my corner, right? And so I feel like this sea of apathy and loneliness is a little bit connected. I feel like the two are not mutually exclusive. And you go back to Robert Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone. And actually, if your listeners want the summary, there's a movie that came out a couple of years ago, I think, on Netflix called Join or
Mhm.
Die. But Robert Putnam basically noticed this phenomenon where he said Americans were still bowling, right? They were still going to the bowling
Right.
alley. But whereas in decades previously, they had been going together in leagues, in clubs, competing, tournaments, all of that sort of stuff. He said today, Americans are bowling alone.
Right.
And you could see that in volunteer communities, so volunteer clubs, whether it was fire brigades, whether it was Rotary clubs, everything was going down. And so you have less spaces for people to come together, to work together on these issues. That also leads to lack of
Mhm.
trust, a decline. And after a while, when you don't have trust in one another, when you don't believe others are helping, when you don't believe in the kindness of our fellow neighbors, I think overall that leads to a collapse in generosity and
Yeah.
giving. Why should I do something if my
Right.
neighbor's not giving?
Right.
And yeah, here's the flip side is one of my favorite reports, and the new report's out this week, the World Happiness Report. Read it because there's a lot of good stuff
We're
in
going
it.
to
It's a
link all
great
this
report.
stuff into the show notes. Keep going.
Well, the World Happiness Report, they do these experiments, right? And they ask people, okay, if you were to drop your wallet in the street, do you believe that neighbor or bystander would pick it up? People say no. They think the neighbor would steal your wallet. And yet, when they ask the individual, if you saw your neighbor drop their wallet or a stranger in the street, would you pick it up and return? They say yes. And actually, when they've done studies and actually tried this out in the past, that's actually found to be
Right.
true. And so we still are, on the whole, innately good, innately kind. And so I think one of the best things we can do is make that visible to one
Mhm.
another
Mhm.
again, create spaces to come together. And this is where my friend Nathan Chappelle, he was the co-author of this great book, The Generosity
Mhm.
Crisis. He talks about the need for radical
Mhm.
connection as a way to make our inherent generosity and kindness visible to one another. And that's where I think community comes in, building that. And I think to go back to Benjamin Franklin, I think it was never intended that you would just leave things to the government alone. You know, alongside being this great scholar, he also was part of the first public library, the first volunteer fire brigade. And so it was always intended to be more than voting in terms of civic engagement and creating spaces for us to do that together. And it's not just that when we work together, we leverage the strengths of others and address these problems, but it's mutually reinforcing. There's that sense that if I see others given, and I think the research bears this out, if I believe others care, I'm more willing to care. If I believe others are showing up, I'm more willing to show up. And in that way, giving becomes contagious. And I guess, how do we do that? How do we create these spaces? How do we make radical connection? I mean, this is where I try and break it down in the book. And what's been interesting to me is I don't think I explicitly have said any of this stuff in the book, but when people have given me their interpretation, they say one of the through lines is community,
Mhm.
right? And
Totally.
there's ideas you can do that. You can build shared goals together. I give the example of the coal community in Western Australia, where I'm from. You can come up with this together. You can follow the money. You can tell those stories, and you can share stories of success. And I think through that, maybe that's how we go from a age of despair to an age of hope. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. All of that and the community. Community is you and me showing up and agreeing to help each other and to find our way forward. And if you were, say, a Dem or a Republican or a this issue person or that issue person, and you show up for your bowling league and you're bowling together, those things go by the wayside. You not only tolerate each other, but you find your common ground and you work your way forward. One of the things that I worry about with community, and you mentioned this with isolation, and we all know this, right? It's how stuck are folks in their digital world, which is being curated to keep their attention versus just putting it down instead of doom scrolling and going outside and doing things together, anything, really anything in your community where you can show up and help and maybe be helped, and spaces. So let's talk about spaces. Let's talk about Global Citizen for a moment and the fact that you all are many years on. You're far away from where you started, but you're consistently creating spaces, these ephemeral moments that are deeply impactful, and the impact goes on such that you keep doing it and the impact gets deeper, and you're becoming known, Global Citizen anyways, for this work. Let's just talk about Global Citizen, its impact, what's on the horizon this year, what are you excited about, and who should be excited? Who is going to be participating? Who are y'all trying to reach? Let's talk about that.
Well, so one of the big campaigns right now, and I was mentioning America's 250th birthday, and this coincides with that over the summer, is of course the fact that the US, together with Canada and Mexico, is co-hosting the FIFA World Cup, which is, of course, one of the biggest
Huge,
sporting tournaments on the
if not
planet.
the biggest. Yeah,
Exactly. And so Global Citizen has been asked to be the charity partner of this incredible tournament.
amazing.
And so together with FIFA, we've launched the FIFA Global Citizen Education Fund. And our goal is over the next 100 days in the lead up and during the World Cup is to raise $100 million to provide education and literacy opportunities for more than 100,000 children, both here in America and around the world. And already through the support of FIFA, they're donating $1 for every ticket, through some of the artists we work with, like The Weeknd, and through generous contributions from the likes of MetLife and the Bank of America, we've already raised almost $30 million.
Nice.
And we've got this campaign underway, businesses stepping up, people stepping up, artists. We've got a lot more to roll out. But the exciting thing is we've already launched a call for applications from incredible organizations doing really awesome work, providing, building out sporting facilities, providing academic support, providing support in some cases to kids who suffer from deafness, other cases maybe to schools and programs specifically working with kids with autism. But it's hugely inspiring. We had more than 3,500 applications. And I can tell you, our team had to whittle this down to the first shortlisted organizations that we're going to announce over the coming weeks. But it was, to me, so inspiring to read these applications, and I'm like, "We gotta raise more money. We gotta do more of this." And I can tell you that the climax of this campaign on July 19th, when the final of the World Cup takes place, Global Citizen will be producing the first ever halftime show of a FIFA World Cup, and this will be entirely focused on driving impact into the FIFA Global Citizen Education Fund and hopefully providing one moment. It's going to be curated by Chris Martin of Global Citizen, who we've worked with for more than a decade now, but hopefully just providing a moment to bring us all together, that radical connection, and focus on not that which divides us, but something which we can all relate to. We all have a teacher, we all have a sport coach, and hopefully bring us all together in a way that we can improve the lives of at least some children around the world.
Incredible. We're going to make sure we link that there so we can add some wind to the sail there. 30 million on 100 already is insane. Congrats, man. And I want to talk about what you're doing here and zoom in on this. One of the themes in the book is it's really hard the infrastructure itself, it's really hard to move funds to action without a high cost. How are
Yeah.
you all thinking about that? So you're going to raise 100 million. Obviously, you have built partnerships and you have gained the trust to be able to hold the responsibility of that special moment where you have the attention and the eyes of hundreds of millions of people around the world. There's no doubt in my mind you're going to crush that goal. Now you have these funds. Now you have the organizations that want to use those funds to advance the outcomes or the goals that we're talking about here. How will you do that? And how do you do that in a manner that doesn't burden them, but also makes sure that the funds are spent responsibly so that everyone who's giving knows it went to the best possible outcome?
It's a really fascinating question. And, in many cases, the organizations applying are small community organizations in different parts of the world. We wanted it to be accessible, including here in New York City. And so the types of grants we're talking about, are in the range of $50,000, $150,000, $250,000, but to these organizations could make a world of impact. And there's a couple of things we've been wrestling with in order to make the process as efficient as possible, to make it one of integrity. As you said, we don't want to burden the organizations we're trying to support, but in a way that will give us what we need to be able to reassure supporters and others that these are incredible organizations doing incredible work. And so, philosophically, a number of questions that we've worked through. The first is, people talk about admin costs and how do you keep admin costs low? And I think here there is often some misperceptions because what gets defined of admin costs, we tend to sometimes write it off and say, is admin costs essential? Is it important? And you hear people clapping themselves on the back when they're like, the lowest amount went to admin costs. And often, when you dive into it, admin cost is often the salaries of the heroes doing the
That's
work,
right.
the charity
That's right.
workers as well. So we want to be very clear on what we are defining as admin and what we're not. And in some cases, you support an organization, maybe their fundraising capability, they could raise a lot more in order to support their mission. So I think it all starts with first, what is the mission of this organization? What is the clear impact that they're going to be able to achieve as a result of this funds, but not getting in and micromanaging and saying you need to spend this on that and that. That's not what we're there to do. But I think a couple of ways in which we want to make sure that we maintain the trust and make sure funds are used appropriately. The first is we're looking at how we integrate technology in the actual assessment process.
Mm.
And just before this, I was on the phone to one of our partners because we as a grant maker, we don't want to hire a lot of people to monitor this. We don't want to hire and spend a lot ourselves on selecting. We want to automate this, run this as efficiently so we can put for as much money as possible to these orgs. And so the assessment we use, how we use small language models to learn from previous applications to get the best, that's all really, really exciting and has helped us streamline the selection process, filtering out those that weren't eligible, and then getting down into and having robust conversations and allowing us to select the best orgs. And we've got this incredible panelist of 5 technical experts who are helping us work this through. Then it's like, how do you track the dollars,
Yes.
right? And we're working with some technology providers on what's known as track and trace. So how do you transparently say for every dollar that you allocate, can you report back on how it's spent and the overall impact? Because we want to use the halftime show and the campaign in the lead up to report on the impact of this. And so for us, that's what is really exciting is hopefully piloting with some technology partners and platforms, hopefully some methodologies that other institutions, other organizations could then deploy as well. And I guess thirdly, I'm really excited about how these organizations, we might be able to make AI or technology available to them in a way that could help them improve their general operations as
Mm.
well. I mean, we in America talk about things now like ChatGPT as if we all have access. But for many of these orgs that are applying, things like access to reliable internet, reliable energy is still a thing.
Yeah,
Like, we
totally.
shouldn't forget in sub-Saharan Africa, 600 million people still go without access to reliable energy. And so we're thinking through, well, how in making grants can we bundle some extra tools so that we could help these orgs, bear the fruits in terms of productivity of what we're able to do here in America. So it's really exciting and it's important and it's an imperative because we know trust is at an all-time low. So I'm really excited for how we might be able to come up with some good case studies that all of these other orgs with far greater sums than our funding could take up and adopt.
Amazing. Amazing. It's heartening to know that it's not just about raising the funds, it's how we deliver the funds, how we get the funds to the end point with the least amount of burden. And so that we can ensure that they're doing what they need to do, they're enabled to do what they need to do, and that you can share to those who gave. At the end of the day, they're going to give again if they know that you did right with those funds and that you're able to get them to the end point. That's amazing. Let's talk about how hard it is to bring all the stakeholders together to create space. So you're obviously an expert at this now, but for nonprofits in the States or anywhere really, NGOs from small to large, this is the work, right? The
Yeah.
work is I'm going to serve one community or population. I'm generally going to do fundraising with another that cares or maybe is directly affected or comes from that community or maybe not. But we have multiple stakeholders here and we have to find a space to bring them together and to do it in a way that's not exploitive, to do it in a way that has integrity, and with respect and dignity. And I'm certain that you've faced these challenges and even critique
Yes.
over the years. So how do you all approach this work when it comes to bringing together multiple stakeholders to make an impact?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was interviewing leaders and incredible successful, whether they're policy entrepreneurs, fundraisers, leaders of their communities, people just who had racked up all these great impact metrics, I was asking them, well, what was the key or if there was any one insight or lesson. And there was one common denominator across the board, which came up again and again. And that was creating change requires working with people you don't always like
Mm,
or agree with. And one of the biggest hurdles they often found, these leaders, as I was interviewing them, is often the biggest sources of tension weren't necessarily with the imperfect partners they were trying to work with. It was quote unquote their own tribe,
mm,
their own people. And you often had people almost feeling this pressure from their own supporters not to engage with others, even though they knew that that was necessary, but not to engage out of fear of being branded a traitor or being accused of doing something wrong, right? And so in the book, I call this pragmatic idealism, but it's being aware that there are trade-offs. And I talk about the perils of applying so-called purity tests to every engagement or organization because none of us are perfect. And of course, there's spectrums of imperfection out there,
mhm,
right? From disagreement on issues all the way to things that just from a basic risk management perspective, you're saying, okay, well, we're not going to touch that, obviously. And so I've been spending a lot of time with the book. Often the audiences I engage with, I was in Melbourne a few weeks ago and it was these nonprofit fundraisers and I was talking to them about how they come up with a framework for managing who they take money from, how they engage, and how to make sure that they don't overcorrect and don't operate from a place of fear,
mm,
because in doing so, they might actually give up an opportunity to create a big chunk of impact in the world. And this was something I've had to go through myself, and I've experienced it. So when I speak to these leaders and when I was writing the book, it was something I personally could relate to. In 2022, when we was just coming out of the pandemic, at Global Citizen, we had been involved in this effort at the time to influence. There was this piece of bipartisan legislation going through Congress, or attempted bipartisan legislation. It was the infrastructure bill, and we were working with many of these groups working on conservation in America, nature preservation, deforestation, planting more trees. We were working with them to get funding into this bill to basically reforest communities across America,
mm,
right? And it was incredible, the orgs we worked with. But I still remember it came down to this pivotal moment for us where we were doing this event and we had invited one of these senators who was from the South. He was from Louisiana. And we invited him to come to our event specifically to be interviewed by the CEO of an organization called American Forests about this issue, right? And our goal was to get him on record to get his support for getting this funded in the bill. And we're talking about billions of dollars in difference. And what happened is in the weeks leading up to that, the Roe versus Wade decision had come down in the Supreme Court where they overturned the ban on abortion, right? And this particular senator had made some comments about that personally I didn't agree with, and many others in the organization didn't agree with. But we felt, well, our event was specifically about boosting support for nature. And on this, he was one of the allies and his support was critical. So we went through, we had this event, and I remember as soon as this event was over, there I was finishing up the end of the day. I was at our office with my wife, was getting ready to go, left through the elevator, came down, walked out the front. It was already nighttime. And as I walked onto the pavement outside the office, I was accosted by this guy who had clearly been standing there for a while and was visibly distressed. You could see it on his face. And he just walked up to me and he said, "How dare you? How dare you?" And I was like, "What?" I had no idea what he was initially talking about. And then he goes on and he said, "How dare you have that man on your stage?" And of course, that man he was referring to was that senator that we had invited to be. And he said, "How dare you have him after everything he said?" And the reality is, I spoke to this guy, explained our reasons, but the reality is in the months afterwards, that bill did pass with his support. And in the years following, more than 1.5 billion was allocated and that was delivered. This was something that was actually done. And think like the equivalent of 500,000 football fields of new forest has been planted or protected across America since as of that funding. And so I think back on that. Were we right? Were we wrong? But that was the impact we were able to create together. And that was my experience when I talk about, well, what does it mean to create change and how do you work with people who you don't always agree with on everything?
Yeah. Wow. Tribalism is so intense right now, and I'm sure throughout history, but it really does. And the purity test, and I'm also at fault for this at times and have been, is you lose your tolerance for the other. And there may be things that you can align with on the other, and clearly things that you don't align with. I had a neighbor share with me last year at some point. He said, I'm scared to share with people who I voted for. I'm scared to share that with my family because I don't want them to not let me join them at Thanksgiving at the dinner,
Yeah.
right? And it's just a very sad state when can we agree to disagree? Can we tolerate each other? I think it's naive or arrogant to think that we're always going to agree on things. Just
Yeah.
from one to the next, even if you're really closely aligned on certain issues. I find with my partner, my wife, I thought we were very aligned on a lot of issues, and then we had kids.
Yeah.
And it became clear that we weren't on different issues, and then we had to work through them and find the middle ground. And I think that's a really powerful story. And I thank you for sharing that. I think it takes guts to do the work and to share that and to know, this is the lane I'm in right here, and to be willing to take some flack because that lane is going to lead to outcomes. You said something like 500,000 football field equivalents of protected or new forest. That matters.
Yeah.
Right? That matters. And I appreciate that. Michael, I could talk to you on, and I hope that we can talk more. I did take some notes here to chat with you about. And I'm choosing at this moment not to read those notes. And I'm actually going to go to a passage here in the book that you close with that I highlighted that I think actually really matters here. Let me grab it. We live in a world on fire. Each passing day brings new negative headlines, highlighting how dire our situation is, how divided we've become, and how deep our troubles run. But remember, nothing is inevitable. We are not prisoners of fate.
Okay.
While we can't predict the future with certainty, we have the power to shape it. Beneath the surface, people are tirelessly working to make a difference in their own ways, albeit unevenly and gradually. These are all worthy endeavors. However, to tackle our challenges, we urgently need systemic policy change. We need effective policy entrepreneurs to deliver and see through implementation over the long term. This necessity persists even in the face of society's inclination toward the immediate gratification of taking down the other or being intolerant of the other and taking them down, a preference for feeling safe, righteous, certain, and right. What I love about this book, Michael, is you do not shy away from calling it how it is, and that you really speak to what's going on and with relevance and maintaining optimism. And I want to end on optimism, if you will. Those of us who get into this work, whether it be me or you or our colleagues that want to make a difference, we are heart-led. We are purposeful individuals. I feel like it actually lives inside of everyone. all just don't get to activate it, but it's not easy work. How do you maintain optimism in the face of all that you see? And I would imagine that you've probably seen far worse than most of us have seen, given your global travels.
Just hearing you read that, part of the inspiration for that statement at the end came from the great Jane Goodall,
Mm,
right? Sadly,
who we just
she
lost.
passed away,
Yeah.
last year, but the year before that, in 2024, she actually came and spoke at the age of 90 at the Global Citizen Festival on stage. And one thing that was so incredible about her was her unflinching optimism. And he used to say that there is still a lot worth fighting for. And she said, every day we wake up, we have a choice because our actions do impact someone else or something in some shape, way, or form. And we have a choice each day on how we're going to go about that. And, as to your point, I've seen very deep extreme poverty. I've seen places where I've seen literally a grandmother barely in her early 20s with her 12-year-old daughter, who in turn is holding a 6 month
Mm,
old baby, right? I was in Poland just weeks after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine and saw refugees flowing across the border from Ukraine into Poland. And I've also seen the impact of climate change up front and very real, just to name a few of the things I've seen. But I've also been blown away beneath the headlines by incredible entrepreneurs, people leading the charge, often without much fame or without much glory, whether it was these incredible advocates in South Africa. And I have a chapter on them, as you would know, in the book, who certainly, these young women growing up in the townships in South Africa, when I met with them and when I worked with them, you could feel the anger, you could feel the rage where they would tell me that, the fact that, sorry, some girls lose up to 60 days of school a year because they lack something as basic as sanitary pads or napkins when they get their period.
mm,
And yet, through the campaign we worked on together, and again, it was always two steps forward, one step back. Everyone here will tell you that change, it never really finishes. It's something you have to be committed to, and it's a constant thing. And yes, there was upheavals, there was setbacks, but because of their efforts in the 7 years since I've met them, something like more than 4.3 million girls in South Africa have received access to these sanitary pads and napkins, which they might otherwise have not done. And just maybe for some of those 4.3 million girls, that was the difference between staying in school or dropping out school. I've seen communities in the Caribbean, some of them hit by ever frequent hurricanes and extreme weather events. I've seen them literally change the way that loan agreements are struck with big banks and institutions to ensure that if they're hit by a hurricane, category 5 hurricane, that they're not left high and dry and that they have the resources to immediately put that into hospitals, to immediately pay food, to immediately keep the lights on so they're not put back into extreme poverty. And I've seen co-workers come together with trade union activists and literally say, yes, this coal mine might be shutting down, but we're not going to let our town shut down with it. And I've literally seen a community revitalized with new funding, an abandoned or degraded Main Street revitalized, tourism coming back, and more people visiting this town than ever before. I think for me though, and I finished with this story in the book, in the epilogue, one of the things that always stays close to me is this story that as I was finishing writing the book,
we're going to talk
I
about
got a
Len.
yeah, Len, yeah. The story of how Len's story came about was actually my wife and I were about to give birth to our first child, and I was in a rush to finish the manuscript because everyone had told me when your child comes, you're going to have zero life. And so I rushed out this manuscript. I pulled all these all nighters. I still have the photo. It was a 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning that I submitted this manuscript, the first draft. And my wife and I, we had 2 weeks before she was meant to be due. And we are going to go out to Broadway shows, going to do all this stuff, right? Before our life was allegedly over for the next few months. A phone call from my mum. My mum works as an aged care worker in Australia, principally with people with dementia or Alzheimer's or people who just need extra assistance in the later years of their life. And she said, there's this elderly guy that's come in, said his name's Len, and he said to me, "Are you Michael Sheldrick's mum?" And my mum said, "Do you know this guy, Len?" And the only Len I could think of that might fit this category was 20 years ago, getting home from school. And, there were periods in my life where I was bullied at school, didn't have many friends, and I'd get home and I'd walk the dog. I'd go down to the local park, and there was this guy there. He had these two walking sticks, and you could never forget him because he had a dog and it was called Tramp because it literally, with its wiry gray hair, looked like the dog from the Lady and the
Yeah.
Tramp.
Okay.
And and I said to my mom, I said, "I think so, but that surely can't be the same guy." And she goes, "Yeah, he's 105
Wow.
and he remembers you." So before you know it, I'm FaceTiming Len and speak to Len, tells me a story, born 1939, born 1917, gets married 1939. And he tells me about the outbreak of the war, finds himself in France. France gets destroyed by the German war machine. He finds himself on the last remaining boat back to England, gets told by his commanding officer, "Len, I've got no men to spare. I need you to go and defend this town because the enemy's going to parachute above." And Len's just describing to me as this young man at the time. He just rallies everyone and pitchforks and all, and they go down and they meet the enemy parachuting above the town. And I just remember I paused him at this point on FaceTime. I still remember it. I was actually sat where I am now, and I still remember it. And I said, "Len, I meet so many people today who think life is hopeless. They don't even try. What you're describing to me sound pretty dire. Did you think it was over? Did that cross your mind, like this might be it?" And he just looked at me and he said, "No, we kept saying to ourselves that we haven't got much, but we'll give it a go. We're not running away. Give it a go. We're not running away." And I think back to that, and a few days after that, again, another lie. People told us that your first baby never comes early. Turns out that wasn't true. I told her Russian to meet us. And then a few weeks after that, I get a phone call from my mum, and she said the day before had been Len's 106th birthday, and his daughter had come in to see him, and he had said, "Haven't got anything else to give. It's up to others to give it a go."
Mm.
And he had passed away that night at 106. And I reflect back on that because as I've been on the book tour, I've had the opportunity to meet so many incredible people. And I genuinely do believe that, if I was asked how's this all going to turn out, I don't know. No one can predict the future. But I genuinely do believe that if you ever wanted to live a profoundly meaningful life, then today is actually a gift because of the actions today, people born 50 years from now will be impacted as a result. And we do generally have more at our fingertips than any other previous generation to make a difference. So in that sense, when we go apathy to agency, we actually look at the opportunity to live a profoundly meaningful life, then despite all of the negative headlines, it really, really is a gift and an opportunity to be alive right now. And I guess the question for your listeners, and this is what I ask myself every day, is, you know, yeah, we may not have much, but what are we doing? And are we gonna run away, or at the very least, are we gonna give it a go?
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. That's a beautiful place to stop. Get in motion. Give it a go. Today is a good day. Let's make it better. Let's find a way. I don't read a lot of new books this year. This year is my year of rereading old books that have been sitting on my shelf that I keep. Most books I don't keep. I'm going to keep this book. I say that humbly. This is an incredible book. Anybody who's interested in social impact and making the world better, We'll learn from the stories. We'll learn from your experience here. We'll get some mental frameworks to think about how they can be most effective. I think this book is going to live on and not just be about a book in this moment, but a book that people will look back on and say, that's a smart way to approach this work. And this book will help me do the work that I'm trying to do and make the world better. So I will link this in the show notes. I just want to say thank you so much. Truly humbled that you spent some time with us today. We will see you in New York when we're there next. And thank you, Michael.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you.